The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. As always, I'm your host, David Wilms. As always, Nephi Cole is sitting across the internet from me as your co-host. Nephi?
Do you think that you'll perform better today having sipped a soda just before you started?
Hey, I had to do what you always do, and this time you weren't actually drinking anything when I called on you. That was great.
But I'm double fisting it. See, I have one for each hand.
I can't. You've got some blur feature on your Zoom. I can't even see what they are. They just look like two empty hands.
It blurs the background. Don't you use that? I use that on all
It blurred
my
the foreground too. It blurred whatever you were holding in your hands. You just had two hands up with nothing in them.
I don't want to endorse anybody on accident. Nobody's paying for this. So,
we don't even publish. I was going to ask you this, and maybe we should ask people listening to this. A lot of podcasts these days, even when they're done on Zoom like this,
they publish the video.
They're recorded and they put them on YouTube for people to watch.
Yeah.
Should we do that?
That sounds like a terrible idea.
It sounds like more work, doesn't it?
Yeah. So first of all, what's YouTube? How do you go about putting stuff on YouTube? That's an interesting question. I guess we could.
Hey, boomer.
Well, it's just a lot of work. Keeping these people happy. They just always want more. You listeners, you guys you're never happy. It's never good enough.
Why did I even bring this up? I really legitimately was asking, and I'm legitimately curious.
Kidding. It's actually a good question.
It's a question I'm posing, and actually, if you're listening and have thoughts, let us know. Your Mountain at itsyourmountain.com. Do you prefer to catch these podcasts, listening to them, on audio as you're walking the dog or traveling or mowing your lawn or ignoring your family, whatever your choice is?
Yeah.
Or do you want to sit at your computer or watch on YouTube? Do you prefer to do that? Or do you like both options? Let us know. We'll probably still won't do it, but let us know.
Yeah. Tell us what you think so we can ignore you. Because the thing is, then you'd have to put on you're wearing an old tank top right now. It looks like
I'm not.
It says I know. I just wanted
I'm wearing
to give
a
the
Your
visual
Mountain sweatshirt
of you in a 1980s Gold's Gym tank top with flabby white arms. You think people want to see that? Those flabby white arms.
They want to see this Your Mountain sweatshirt that I'm wearing.
Yeah, I mean,
it's good stuff.
We don't want people to have to go to the gun show every time they come on the podcast.
For folks that didn't see that because you're not watching it, Nephi literally just put his arms up and flexed like the bro he is.
Well, I think it's a great idea. Now that I think about it, this is the best idea you've ever had. Putting this thing on the YouTubes. Then Then it's like we're on TV. Then we're almost Steven Ranella. We're so close. Because what's the difference then? Because people could watch us on YouTube. They could watch him on Netflix.
Money. We don't make money. That could be the difference.
So back to why we have the blur feature on. It's because, Pepsi, they're not sponsoring this podcast, and I don't want to give them free revenue or whatever.
You just mentioned it. You just gave free revenue, and I'm glad you did. I'm also drinking Pepsi, incidentally.
Delicious.
And,
in an old
Pepsi.
Cup, like a cup that looks like you got it from a mini mart 4 years ago. So this actually looks like an old pizza. It looks like you stole that cup from Pizza Hut is what it looks like.
Do you remember this cup? This is another cup I'm holding.
Dave is holding up a 44-ounce cup that he spits sunflower seeds in. He just held it up so I could see the seeds in it. And you've been spitting sunflower seeds in that cup for at least a decade. I don't think it's so I'm looking to see if I've worn off the
the copyright date on this. This is an old Taco Bell cup that I used to have when we worked in the governor's
I
office
know.
together.
It's a law. It's an
same-
old cup.
It's the same cup, and I believe it's from 2016. You know how the Taco Bell cups are clear now, and they have been for years?
Yeah.
This one is one of the
So
old.
somehow you've moved, you've renovated your office, you've moved offices, and somehow this old cup that doesn't even, like the outside of the cup, doesn't even have anything on it anymore. So it used to be a plastic cup, it has like words and stuff, and now it just looks like smudges because
I found
it's so
something on
old.
here. It's advertising the 2017 MTV VMA Awards, which were incidentally Sunday on August 27th at 8:00, 7 Central. Anyway, that's enough
And the
about that
only
cup.
way that I would know that you ever were, and the funny thing is how that cup has to have been close to a trash can so many times because you've obviously emptied the sunflower seeds. You could take that old piece of rubbish, that garbage cup, and just drop the entire thing in the trash can and get a new cup. But you won't. You
I
won't.
I've washed
No.
the inside out of it once a year.
Because it's because your trash is like fine wine. You just think the older stuff gets, the better it gets.
I think this might be older than my youngest child. Anyway, that's not what we wanted to talk about, right?
This is older, so this is what you can't see because it's blurred again. But this is older than my oldest child. Right here.
But that's a Nalgene bottle. Those are meant to last.
That's exactly right. That's what you should be investing in. Something that you should be purchasing that's supposed to last a long time. Not just, have you got a styrofoam cup there somewhere?
I'm looking around to see what I've got that I
let's
could show you,
move on.
but no, I don't. So we can just move on. We
so
should
much
move
for
on.
so much for the sponsorships.
So much for the sponsorships. No Taco Bell sponsor, no Pepsi sponsor.
Yep.
Oh well. Anybody out there want to sponsor, shoot us an email, yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com.
We'll probably ignore it, but give it a
we've
shot.
Never taken
I mean, hey.
we've never accepted sponsorships before, but we could change for the offers, right?
Well, we have too much integrity to care what.
No, we don't
Say
care
that.
about hemorrhaging money, do we?
Obviously not.
We're about as fiscally responsible as the government.
I'd say we're more fiscally responsible than the government because, I can make that pitch. I don't know if it's true, but I'll make it.
I was today. I've got to give a quick shout out to a great friend of mine. I was at the robing ceremony today of one of my best childhood friends. Known him since I was 6 years old. TJ or Timothy Forwood. He just was sworn in today as a circuit court judge here in our town here, or my town here. You moved in my town here in Cheyenne. And I went to his ceremony today and got to see a bunch of friends, got to see our old co-host, Mike McGrady, who's also now a district court judge in Gillette, Wyoming. If you're in my orbit, you become a judge. That's what I'm finding out. Now I got to see another great friend of ours, James Castee, also a judge out in Evanston now. It was just an amazing experience. It was so great to be there with friends and his family and see somebody that I've known for my entire life get sworn into a job that he's been working towards for his entire life. And it shows me how at least in our state, the state judiciary is in a great place. And I'm just really, I'm excited for him. I'm excited for Mike. We've talked about him before in his judgeship, but today it was all about TJ, and I was just really proud of him and excited for him as he takes on this new role. I don't think it's anybody we've ever talked about before, but in his role, he'd been a prosecutor before, and he'd prosecuted a lot of poaching cases, and had done a lot of good for wildlife, in addition to all of the other criminal law that he dealt with all over the course of his career. He was at an assistant district attorney, and then he was an assistant United States attorney, and now he's a state circuit court judge, and just couldn't be prouder of him. But I have to give that shout out because we're going to be talking about something today that has a legal nexus, but not with him, not with him.
Yep.
But
And I think
just had to do that.
the fact that all these people in your orbit who I happen to know as well are becoming judges. That's why people should remember that you should not expect the judicial system to be perfect. That's my take-home message. Because unfortunately, I've known all these people for over a decade. So, and I've seen the pictures, Dave. I've seen the pictures.
You work hard, you play hard. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. If I were you guys, I would, I would get out I would be smashing hard drives if I were you guys. That's what I'd be doing.
Those photos are my get out of jail free card.
Yes. Well played,
no, I'm
Dave.
I'm kidding.
Yeah. So we're not really talking about something the courts have done right now. We're going to talk about something that's, unfortunately, it's what they may do. It's things that are going to impact judicial decisions. And this is why I think that it is relevant. And I actually think there is a nexus in talking about, remember that judges are people too, that the courts are people too. And that, these things become interesting because, it's hard to take, although people try, we try and make the most objective decisions we can on important things that have to do with things like justice and law and what's right. But sometimes it's very hard for people to, just because of, everybody's got a personal, background, a place you came from, a way that you see the world that fades into how you think. And certainly we're from Wyoming. And so when you say, ask us about something that we think is important, like let's say, grizzly bears, that might be something that we're going to have a very specific and strong opinion about. Well, why do we have a specific, strong opinion about that? Well, I don't know about you, Dave, but I've been working with and around, close to bear country with people who work in bear country, dealing with ESA issues with bears, professionally for, a couple, 20 years. How about you?
Same here.
And so
yep.
You get some really strong opinions when you work in that space, especially when you've got a track record of thinking about it from 20 years. You don't see things the same as, somebody hands you a teddy bear and says, "Do you think this thing is cute?" Right? It's pretty easy for you to look at that thing and say, "Oh yeah, man, that's really cute. Like that's a cool thing. I have a immediate opinion of this thing that I'm seeing now for the first time, this issue that I'm considering now for the first time." But if you've had to live with that thing for 20 years, it's kind of like a golden retriever. Murphy, plug your ears. So the golden retriever is a really fun, cute puppy, but the longer you have it, the more times he's throwing up, the more vet trips, the more you really have a sense of what it takes to be committed to that golden retriever back there. Grizzly bears are very much the same. When you are dealing with grizzly bears in the West, especially if you're in the grizzly bear recovery area, you have a track record. You have train tracks from having lived with this, issue for years, and it affects how you view these things. And of course, we've had a decision from the current administration, or for another couple weeks, on grizzly bears that just came out. Dave, what happened?
Man, I've been thinking about how to explain this. And I'm going to lead in with this. And then we'll go from there, because I think this will sum it up. And then we'll talk about the details. The way I describe this is Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho have become victims of their own success. And what do I mean by that? I mean, those states have been so successful over the course of the past almost 50 years in recovering grizzly bears and bringing them back from the brink of extirpation in the lower 48 states. A reminder that when grizzly bears were listed in 1975 under the Endangered Species Act, estimates were that there were as few as 136 bears left in the greater Yellowstone area. Today, there are over 1,000, well over 1,000 in the greater Yellowstone area. There are more than 2,000, well over 2,000 in the lower 48 states now.
And when you say well over, let's just say, those numbers, and it's important that people understand this, the numbers that people use to, and we've covered this in other podcasts. When we say those numbers, that's not because everybody lines the bears up and counts, there's not a count off or like I'm bear at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What happens is there are models based on location that are used to predict the overall population level. And let's just say when we're using that number, it is extremely conservative. There are far more bears than that number suggests. It's just that we use the conservative number. Why do we use the conservative number? Because this is conservation work, and we don't want to overestimate the population. And so, there are well more. When we say 1,000 and 2,000, there's a lot more bears than that. But those are the numbers we use, and they are scientific in origin.
Yeah, like you can say with a high level of confidence, like say a 95% confidence interval if you're into statistical analyses, right? You can say with a 95% confidence interval that there are, over 1,000 bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
Yeah, and you can
the
also
reason you can say it with that level of confidence is because you've run a very conservative model estimator to make sure that you can have a high level of confidence that you have that number. But it likely means, I'm no statistician, but if you ran a model and it said 1,500 bears or 1,800 bears, it might be more like a 70% confidence interval or 60%. You might not be as precise with your.
But the likelihood is there's that many.
But the likelihood is that there are more than what they say, not less than what they say.
Far more. And that's the thing. When you said the likelihood, the everyday average, back of the envelope that we would do if we were out, not shooting for that confidence interval, it is going to be, when you are hitting that 1,800 number, it's going to be more like that. It's a lot of bears.
Yeah, I'm not going to say how many bears there are. We don't know how many bears there are. So I'm going to stick with we are highly confident there are at least, 1,050 or whatever the number is. We'll call it around 1,100 bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We'll say there's a high level of confidence. There are likely more than that, but let's just stick with this. We'll say what the high confidence is. But my point being, in 1975, they're listed as threatened, and there are very few bears, and they really are tracking in the direction of extirpation in the lower 48 states. And they have these strongholds. The last remaining strongholds tend to be in national parks, not outside the parks. There are very few bears outside of the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park in 1975. Rare, exceedingly rare to see a bear in Grand Teton National Park in 1975. Now these places are full. Like they've expanded into places they haven't been seen in 100 years. There was a bear killed, at least one, in the Bighorn Mountains by where you are, Nephi, earlier this year, or not, maybe relocated. Maybe it wasn't killed. Maybe it was trapped and relocated.
Yep.
Relocated, but and they're moving out into the plains of Montana, and so when I say a victim of their own success, the states have been remarkably successful working with federal land management agencies, state wildlife management agencies, tribes, the federal government, tens of millions of dollars going into conservation to reduce conflict, to increase populations and stabilize these populations, with a goal of recovering and ultimately delisting grizzly bears. I'm going to get to what happened. I'm going to tell you what happened, but then I'm going to go back and tell you how we got to what happened and then give you more details on what happened. So I'm going to do you the quick summary of what happened, but I think we have to go back in time to know why we got to where we got. So what happened? Here's the high level, what the Fish and Wildlife Service just did. They received petitions from each state. Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming submitted 3 separate petitions to delist grizzly bears. Idaho asked for delisting grizzly bears range-wide. Some time ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service said, nah, not doing that. Montana asked for the Fish and Wildlife Service to create a distinct population segment in the northern Continental Divide, the area around Glacier National Park. Created what's called a distinct population segment. We'll get to that, more of that here in a bit. And delist that segment. Wyoming petitioned for the service to create a distinct population segment for the greater Yellowstone area and delist that population segment. What the Fish and Wildlife Service did is they denied Wyoming's petition and they denied Montana's petition. And then they reclassified grizzly bears. So they effectively delisted grizzly bears every place they aren't and where they don't want them to be around the country. They then created a distinct population segment for the areas that are left, but made it one distinct population segment and classified that segment, listed it. The intent is to list that as a threatened distinct population segment with an accompanying what's called 4D rule. Here's the kicker, and then we'll explain why this is a big deal. The kicker is that distinct population segment covers, and I should preface this by saying, part of the recovery process for grizzly bears, there have been 6 different recovery areas for grizzly bears. Greater Yellowstone was one of them. Northern Continental Divide around Glacier was another. There are 4 others as well. And those were viewed as separate recovery areas and could potentially be delisted individually. What the service did is they said, we're gonna draw one big DPS, and it's going to include all of those recovery areas and all the areas around those recovery areas. So the way I best can describe it is it's all of Washington State. It's most of Montana. In fact, I think the DPS on the northern and eastern side runs all the way out to the North Dakota border. It includes, looks like probably about half, maybe a little more than half of Wyoming, and probably 3/4 of Idaho. And so that's the deal. Like, they were going to list that entity, say we can't delist these other 2, these petitioned entities. We can't delist those, and instead we're going to reclassify as one big population unit, like a meta population in the lower 48, everywhere we want bears to be, and say they are not ready to be delisted yet, listed, threatened, with a 4D rule. And so that's the deal. And I'm going to say this one comment, and then we'll go back in time. And I'll pause for a second, Nephi, if you have anything you want to say before I go back in time a little bit to say why this matters, right? But my commentary on this is, this decision, should it be allowed to move forward, and we'll talk about that too, should it be allowed to move forward, effectively means that my children will probably never see grizzly bears delisted in the lower 48 states. That's the practical reality of what this decision means. Nephi, before I get into some of the wonky stuff, any immediate response, reflection, or add-ons before I go into some of the more wonky history here?
Yes, it's just depressing. And so when you said they're victims of their own success, so here's what you've done. You made a promise when the bear was delisted, there was a delisting goal set. So there was a number of bears that needed to be reached. And Dave, correct me, what was the number?
Oh man, it's moved so many times. Like
it
was
the original 600,
one,
was it not?
That was the second time. I want to say at one point it was like 300, and then we buffered to 400, and then we buffered to 500, and then we
And those are all
again.
using conservative estimates. And so those were the goals. Those were the goalposts that were set for the delisting process to begin. So to get the bears off the list, so the bears could be managed by state wildlife agencies, and they could be treated like everything else that state wildlife agencies do a great job of managing. So what could be depressing about that? Well, what you have is people who worked under the assumption that they were working towards this common goal of recovering the bears so that they could be managed normally. What you essentially had happen now is you had the service with this decision is basically saying you did such a good job that now you are responsible for everybody else's failures. I don't know if I'm making any sense with that, but now you get to grow bears for everybody else because because we have to increase their numbers everywhere. And so am I headed down the right direction, Dave?
I'm not sure. Let me try this. Maybe this will help steer you. So let me explain why they did this.
Okay.
So, okay. There have been, the service 2 other times has attempted to delist grizzly bears. Right? Back in, 2007, I think, and I want to say 2018 2018. And I might be off by about a year on both of those, but I'm going to be close. It was 2007 for sure. 2007, Service moves forward and tries to delist grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area. And they do it, and ultimately the district court and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reinstate the protections and cite a couple of problems with that delisting. Most notably, what was the impact of the loss of whitebark pine, of what was viewed as a pretty significant food source for a certain segment of the population of bears, that the service failed to analyze. Okay, what was the impact of whitebark pine decline?
This was in
on bears?
07.
That was in 07.
Yeah.
So the service went back and did what was called a food synthesis report and determined that, man, bears will eat anything. They're, opportunistic omnivores. They'll just pretty much eat anything. And the decline in whitebark pine meant they just found something else. And so their food synthesis report, I'm oversimplifying, but said they're not really a threat. They're fine. They're not really a threat.
They're not solely dependent on that.
Right. And so they moved forward again. Of course, that decision was in 2009, right? By the court, remanded to the district court in 2009. So after the 2007 decision, so it took you 2 years to go through the legal process, and then a remand, and then 2011 you had a Ninth Circuit opinion affirming the district court. So you had now what's almost a 4-year judicial process, and then it took time to do the food synthesis report. And then they had to go through and do a new delisting rule, which took a number of years, 6 more years after that decision. And in 2017, we got a second effort to delist the greater Yellowstone ecosystem.
I remember this one really well. And the reason I remember this one well is because I was sitting in a meeting with Governor Matt Mead, with Butch Otter, and with
Governor of Idaho,
and with the governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, and then the director, Dan Ash. Correct? At the time,
Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director.
And so, in that meeting, there was I don't know if there was 12 people in the meeting, but it was in Dan Ash's office, and I can tell you, everyone in that meeting knows that we met the recovery goal. Everyone in that meeting was shaking their head and saying, and knows and said, yes, they're recovered, and that is everyone in that meeting. There was no arguing about whether or not the metrics had been met, about whether or not the goalposts had been reached. There were a few discussions from then Director Ash about other things going on and other people's opinions and things that came in from the outside. But everybody who was party to the original agreement, the original covenant to work together on recovering the bears is in agreement. The bears were recovered at that time.
Right. And so they moved forward with a proposal to delist. And in fact, it was initiated by the Obama administration, right? It was initiated by the Obama administration to delist grizzly bears. And then it was litigated. And I think it was finalized. It might have actually been finalized it was initiated by the Obama administration, finalized by the Trump administration to delist grizzly bears. 2017. Yeah, that's the timing. That's the right timing. Yeah, 2017. So what happened then? The initiation started before that. The finalization was in 2017 during the Trump administration, but the Obama administration started it in 2016, the process. So what happened there? Well, it was litigated. And again, the district court vacated the rule, meaning they remanded the rule, or they vacated the delisting rule and reinstated protections for grizzly bears. And they cited 3 main deficiencies in support of this decision. They said the service didn't sufficiently assess the effect of delisting the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population on the recovery of grizzly bears in the rest of the lower 48 states. They said the service and its partners did not commit to what's called recalibration of potential new population estimators in the future to ensure the ongoing applicability of the conservation, what was called conservation strategies, mortality limits. And the third thing was that the service didn't adequately address the genetic health of the grizzly bear population. And that was appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals again. And again, it was affirmed the district court's decision and remanded back the final rule back in, and basically, long story short, the listing rule went back into effect. And so that was in 2019, excuse me, 2020 is when July of 2020 is when that opinion was reached. So here we are 4.5 years later, and the three concerns were arguably addressed by the states in the meantime. This model estimator, you can go back and listen to earlier podcasts. This is a complex thing, but it was the big concern was we had a super, super conservative model estimator that suggested we had 674 bears and that we were committing to manage for 674 bears. But everybody knew that when this new model estimator that was being perfected was perfected and finally deployed, that we'd actually find out that there are more than 1,000 bears out there, not 674. We just had to wait on the science to show the confidence for that. And so there was this concern that if we adopted a new model estimator that said there were 1,100 bears, but we were committing to managing for 674, that we'd immediately kill half of the bears. And that caused people concern, and the court felt it wasn't adequately explained in the delisting rule. Well, the states addressed that concern in the interim and committed to maintaining a stable population regardless of the model estimator, for example. But what really happened during this time? Why do we go from the service twice trying to delist the greater Yellowstone ecosystem distinct population segment to now saying we have to cover this huge geography and we can't delist this population segment? And this is the wonkiness. And I think this is the piece that's really, really important to understand, because this is the thing that I've actually been fearing was coming for some time. I view this as a potential vulnerability in the Endangered Species Act, right? Something that wasn't accounted for when it was originally created. So to wonk out for just a second, in 1973, when the Endangered Species Act was passed, it said nothing about this term distinct population segment. You could just list, uplist, downlist, delist species. Well, and so grizzly bears were listed as a species range-wide in 1975. Well, as the act matured a little bit and as the service and others operated under the act over the course of several years, I think they started to recognize that, hey, maybe it makes sense to not list something everywhere, but there might be certain populations of a species that are at risk of extirpation that maybe could be listed. And they call these things a distinct population segment. So, if you have these island populations, a remnant population of something, and you want to save that, you can list. The idea was, let's be able to list that species. So as a distinct population segment. So in 1982, Congress amended the Endangered Species Act and the definition of species to include a species is also a distinct population segment, so that it allowed for the listing, the uplisting, the downlisting, or the delisting of a distinct population segment. Well, this actually created some challenges down the road for species like grizzly bears and wolves, because grizzly bears and wolves were not listed as distinct population segments. They were listed everywhere. And so when it came time to recover, when we talk about recovering the greater Yellowstone ecosystem distinct population segment, there's actually no legal construct for that. We put this boundary on a map, we call it the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we create recovery objectives for that, but we were kind of creating this, it was kind of a square peg round hole situation where they were still listed nationwide. So in these two efforts to delist Yellowstone grizzly bears, they actually had to create a distinct population segment for the purposes of delisting it. An easier way to explain it would be like, say you have a puzzle on your table, like all they're doing, and that puzzle is everywhere grizzly bears are listed. They're just taking out a few pieces of that puzzle and calling that a distinct population segment, which is kind of It's not what the act was originally designed to do, but they were trying to do it because there was no way legally to delist grizzly bears nationwide. It was a practical impossibility because socially and for other reasons, grizzly bears aren't going to be everywhere they used to be, and they never will be everywhere they used to be because San Francisco is there, and other municipalities and farms and ranches and all the things that cause conflict, and they're just not going to be everywhere they once were. So they tried to come up with a solution. Well, part of this also resulted in 1996, the Fish and Wildlife Service wrote this policy to define what a distinct population segment is. So if we're going to create one for any purpose, it has to meet the criteria set out in this policy adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Service. That policy, one of the key pieces in there is there has to be discreteness, meaning if you are going to list or delist what is called if you're going to be able to say something is legally a distinct population segment, you have to say that it is not genetically connected to other populations. Think of it as an island, a population that's an island. Now there might be one animal or a couple of animals that move back and forth, but it can't between island populations. But in effect, it has to be this island population that's distinct from other populations, right? And so, and for 50 years, we were operating under this recovery premise of this Northern Continental, these 6 different recovery zones: Northern Continental Divide, Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, Bitterroots, Cascade, North Cascades. Like there's 6 of these, right? And they're separated geographically by some distance, right? And so we were recovering these areas, and never the two shall mix, right? Like they just weren't coming into contact with each other. And actually that turned out to be one of the issues in one of the lawsuits is in the genetics issue, is these populations weren't connected. And so there were concerns about the genetic health of the greater Yellowstone population being isolated. And so there's this agreement of, well, we'll just drop new bears in if there are ever genetic concerns every several years. And in fact, the Game and Fish Department did it this year, dropped in some bears into the greater Yellowstone ecosystems. Well, but what's happened when I said early on, they are a victim of their own success. What's happened is the recovery in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and in the North Cascades has been so profound that the service is unable to actually legally create a distinct population segment for each of them. They don't think it would survive judicial review because they think they might actually be too connected now. They might be too much genetic interchange. And then there's another one, I'm forgetting the name of it, in northern Idaho. That there's a lot of exchange between the Northern Continental Divide and this one in northern Idaho. And so the service is looking at this saying, we now, because you've been so successful, we can't actually delist this distinct population segment anymore because it doesn't actually meet the legal requirements of being a distinct population segment. And so now we have to change the boundary of a distinct population segment to encompass and include everything. And this was the fear I had, and I've had for some time, is that, and I thought it might happen with wolves, where we might actually delist a population and then the remnant populations could never be delisted because they would be so interconnected to the ones that were already delisted. They wouldn't be a distinct population segment, and so you couldn't delist them. That's one of the big fears here, I think, is that if they tried to delist a couple of these DPSs as one, that they'd never be able to delist the others because ultimately there'd be connectivity between them, and they'd violate the DPS policy and they'd violate the law. So this is where I say a victim of their own success. They outgrew the DPSs that we've been operating under, or the idea of what a DPS, distinct population segment, could be. They've outgrown it to the point where the service now can't use it anymore, is what they're saying. And they have to now create this meta population, which as a result of that means now you have to potentially have recovery in all of these other parts of the DPS, which then works to the detriment of the Northern Rockies and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, because now you have to wait for everybody to catch up to you in other places before you can delist the whole population, which is why I said, if this rule were finalized, we might be sitting in a place where
you're waiting for everybody else to catch up to you. And
they're they're slow reproducing species. They're one of the slowest reproducing mammals in North America, and so
the issue is they may never catch up in those areas ever, because that area may not have the same, suitability. And then I guess here's the challenge.
Some of them don't even have bears in them yet.
Yeah. Well, so
like the North Cascades don't have any bears.
What is the recovery plan for these areas now that you're saying are now part of your recovery plan is dependent on these other areas for their recovery plan that don't have either bears or a recovery plan yet? And so it's purgatory. It's listing them in perpetuity. It's listing purgatory, and there's no way to get out of it.
Right. And it's like I said, I'm trying to be as neutral on this as possible. I understand why the service legally felt they had to do this, felt they had to draw the boundaries this way. But we could see this coming for a while. And it's one of the things where if you can see the train coming, it felt like we were instead of trying to stop the train or get out of the way of the train, or something like divert the train, we just set up lawn chairs on the tracks and held a bowl of popcorn. It's and just
funny that you should use that analogy.
Watch the train smash us.
Yeah, because this is using that analogy. I like to take that a little bit further and then say that this is the challenge that we now face because of this. So there's this old tale about a Brazilian native, an Amazonian, who decides that he's going to march out of the Amazons for the first time, and he's gonna go see the big city. He's gonna go to Belém or something like that. Sao Paulo, Rio, any place is great down there. But as he's hiking, he's passes all these animal tracks that he recognizes, and then he hits a set of tracks he doesn't recognize, and he walks down these animal tracks, and they're huge, and he doesn't know what this track is, and he sees the animal running straight on the pathway, running straight at him, and it's screaming and yelling, it's making a ton of noise, and then the animal just runs him right over, and so somebody finds him, takes him to the hospital. He'd never been to a hospital before. Gets out of the hospital, comes out, and there's some children on the ground, and they're playing with a toy train. And he just gets furious. He runs over to the toy train. He stomps on it, and then he kicks it, and the children are crying. And they say, "Why'd you do that?" And he says, "Hey, man, you got to kill these things when they're small," because he'd been hit by a train. So the issue that you run into with this is what has plagued the future of the Endangered Species Act, is people fearing the repercussions of working on a species and acknowledging that the species is there and trying to recover it. Why? Because the feeling was if you had it, it's an incentive to kill it while it's small, to get rid of the problem while it's little and not actually try and grow it. Why? Because you don't know how dangerous the animal is going to become once this thing gets bigger. And this opens the Endangered Species Act up in a huge way for detractors and for people to take shots at the act and to ask for the elimination of the Endangered Species Act. And so the way I see it, there's two directions that this thing can go in the argument now. And one of the directions that it can go is somebody can make the same argument that they've made with wolves, and they can seek specifically for Congress to delist them, just to pass a new law says these things are delisted. That's one. And that might be the best case scenario, because the worst case scenario is that this becomes the poster child for not people who want to reform the Endangered Species Act, but people who are saying this thing needs to be killed while it's still, littler. And I think that's, if you look at the makeup of the government right now, no one should take this lightly.
I would say it this way, and I'm going to go back to my very first statement on this. No law should ever be designed and implemented if succeeding under the law means you're ultimately punished by the law. And I don't know if I'm explaining that perfectly, but I'm saying I've always been a defender of the Endangered Species Act. I really have. I've seen
Still
that there have
am.
been issues with it, and I still am. Like, I think there have been some remarkable success stories, and actually the controversy around the act tends to be limited to just a handful of species. It's actually pretty remarkable what it's the power it has to actually recover species. But in this particular example, like to have, and the thing that's so different from the last two attempts to delist, it felt like the judicial system coming in and kind of
Messing with it.
All
the professionals agreed, hey, we got there. We've done this. All the biologists, the professional managers, the government, the executives, like, nope, we did it. And you had a third party coming in and say, well, you missed looking at something. That's what happened the other times.
Right. I didn't view that as much as a failure with the act itself, because I think the act had worked. It recovered the species to the point where the service said, yeah, we got to get them off the list. I felt like it showed maybe there are some issues in our judicial system potentially. And that's a conversation for another day, even though I led this conversation by saying the state of the judiciary is in good hands. I meant that in state court in Wyoming with my buddies. But
I think it's in great hands everywhere. So go ahead.
Yeah, I do too. But what I will say is what the proposed rule does this time is so profoundly different than the prior two. It's a monumental shift.
It's a monumental rethinking of what is possible, reimagining
and I would argue it's not rooted in the science-ness. I mean, science is part of the delisting always, in part of the process always. But the reason they had to change the boundaries and create this larger DPS was actually because of what I think is a failing of the legal process that led to a situation, again, where you were so successful that the legal construct you put in place doesn't allow you to do the thing that you set out to do anymore, which was to delist greater Yellowstone grizzly bears. Because of the legal construct you have in place with this distinct population segment policy and how that's defined, you became a victim of your success and would have violated the law if you tried to delist bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And that's a problem, because like I think that could have a huge chilling effect on the Endangered Species Act, because this isn't going to be limited to just bears. You might be listening to this from somewhere in the country, and say, I don't have wolves, I don't have grizzly bears. How's this going to impact me?
Because whatever you have, if it could exist someplace else now and you recover it where you are, it doesn't matter. It's never going to come off the list, because it could be someplace else, and you are the stock. You are the growth area.
Yeah, or maybe you're not the stock, maybe you're not the growth area, but you actually have to wait for somebody else to grow their stock, right?
Well, one of the things that was said in this decision was they couldn't predict. One of the arguments made why this was necessary is because they couldn't. Because, well, who knows? If we give it over to state control, we can no longer guarantee. Like, what if what happens to the population in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, and then how does that affect everybody else? Was one of the statements that was made in justifying this, which, to be frank, is extremely hypocritical. And as you know, here, think about this. It wasn't officials from the state of Wyoming that were gunning grizzly bears at the dump in Yellowstone National Park. Wyoming has done really good with its bear management and recovery. And so, but that's what you get. That's the argument from, and I believe this was one of the, a third party, an NGO that said, oh yeah, we can't trust these states. That's why this is necessary. And it's just not based in fact.
Yeah. I mean, you and I both know, having worked for a state, that that's always a frustrating argument, because you and I also know, having worked for a state, that the last thing the states want to do is go through 50 years of this again. of trying to recover a species in these pendulum swings and moving goalposts and all this stuff. Like if they come off the list, like, the states are going to make sure they don't go back on. Like they don't want to go through this again. And yeah, there might be some controversy, some disagreement about policy, about how states intend to do management and the tactics they plan on using and employing for management. But at the end of the day, those are policy discussions to have with the state, because the state's not going to be in a place where they're like, let's just kill all the bears so they're back on the list again. Like they don't want to do that.
No. And
To
be clear, you're the guys who are driving around in trucks and picking up the bears and relocating the bears and monitoring the bears. All those people are wearing badges from the state where they work at. The people who are on the ground doing the work, they're not federal employees. There are some, I don't want to make the federal guys to get mad, but in general, it is these state agencies who are they're the guys who should be getting to take a lap here for their awesome job that they've done recovering these species. And instead, it's punishment.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Let me give you an example of why the chilling effect I could see happening. And I'm going to stick with bears because we're on it. I think it could happen anywhere in the country on anything, but I'm going to use a very specific example. There has been work being done for decades to reintroduce grizzly bears in the North Cascades region of northern Washington, right? And like to the point that this administration, the Biden administration, was moving forward with potentially trying to move forward with reintroducing bears before the end of their term. They're not going to get it done. Secretary Zinke, when he was Secretary of Interior, he was pursuing reintroducing bears in the North Cascades. There are a lot of people there that don't want to see bears on the ground. There are a lot of folks in the local community, ranchers and so forth, that are nervous about having bears on the ground. But they've been at the table. They've been stakeholders. I'm not going to say they agree that they want to see them back. They probably still don't want to see them there. But what this does, something like this, that says you can put them back and have a recovery goal or objective, and then have the whole thing completely blown up to the point where you may never get them delisted. What that tells me is, who's going to sign up for that? Like, who's going to sign up for that recovery effort? That kind of uncertainty, those kinds of moving posts. I've said this isn't really a moving goalpost. This is, we talk about moving goalposts. I see those posts about moving goalposts. Like, I've analogized this to like, this is storming the stadium, tearing the posts down, ripping them into pieces, and hauling them down the street. Like, there's nothing to kick at anymore. There are no goalposts anymore. Like, who's going to sign up for that? And that's where I think there's this chilling effect, is when you want to recover other species, they're going to look at this as an example and say, I don't want to go through what they went through. Why would I agree to have something reintroduced in my backyard?
No, it's kind of funny. I mean, I look at the population segment. You talked about grizzly bears in the Bighorn Mountains, which has never been part of the recovery zone. It is now.
It is now.
Yeah, it is now. As is every mountain range in Wyoming is in there now.
Not the Snowy Range, not the Sierra Madre, not my mountain ranges.
And interestingly enough, like, you can't figure out like why they stop at that spot, because I can tell you, like, they're going to be there. If they get out into these other areas, they're going to be there. And then, suddenly you have, the most curious part about it, you have almost all of Idaho becomes recovery area, almost all of it. And then I can't figure out why they decided to stay away from the mountains, like the area where Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah all meet, around Bear Lake there. They just decided very conveniently to like just stay away from Utah.
Just
and I'm not,
that.
just, and it's just kind of funny because Utah's so, how Utah is on an ESA issues. But it cracks me up because, I mean, there's really no good reason, if you're saying like all these other areas are bear habitat, that the mountains behind Cache Valley aren't. I mean, give me a break. It's just, it's mind-boggling to me, and I can't help but it feels arbitrary. It feels again, you're talking to, we have strong opinions on this. Why? Because we've lived with it for this many years.
Yeah.
We've seen this many iterations of it. We've seen this much discussion on it, and it is frustrating. And it's going to be frustrating for a lot of people, especially lawmakers, and especially, and that's why in these times, these highly political times, this feels political, and it feels like something that has, unfortunately, it could be the impetus for improving the Endangered Species Act, or it could be the pulling the pin in the grenade that destroys it.
Yeah. See, I'm gonna say one thing here that may surprise you a little bit.
Okay.
I don't think it was political. And the reason I say that is this is the scenario I've been fearing for a while. This is like I said, this is the way the law is constructed. I've been worried, and you may have heard me talk about it on this podcast before. I've been worried that we'd find ourselves in this situation where, because of the way this distinct population segment policy is drafted, that if we're really, really successful in recovering a species, that we wouldn't be able to delist, create a distinct population segment out of an otherwise listed species and delist it, because then we'd never be able to delist anything else, or because it doesn't meet the policy anymore. The thing I've been afraid of is happening. The thing that frustrates me a little bit is I think it would have been prudent to look at that distinct population segment policy and say, should we revisit this? Should we look at maybe making changes to it because of what this might do, what this might require us to do, and the chilling effect that might have. So I don't know that it's political, but it's going to be political now, for sure. I don't know that the decision was political. I think it actually might have been actually rooted in the law, but in a law that is flawed, right? And now you can look at it and definitively say, in this scenario, punishes success. And what does that mean? Like, when I say it, that maybe wasn't political, but it is now. The reason I think it is now is it's going to be held up when we should be holding grizzly bears up as one of the greatest conservation success stories on the planet, the recovery here in the lower 48. It's going to be held up now as one of the greatest failures of the act because of the inability to actually get them delisted. And what it's going to lead to is, like, you are going to see, like you said, Nephi, you're going to see bills and may actually succeed this time to try and individually, like, delist grizzly bears, as a species. But you're going to see more than that. You're going to see bills that probably don't go anywhere. You're going to see the usual bills to blow up the act. But you know what you might see you might see efforts to reduce funding for the Ecological Services Division of the Fish and Wildlife Service, which could have the impact of having a really negative impact on a lot of species as a way of punishing the service for this decision. That could easily happen with the incoming Congress if they're frustrated enough, right? You could also see, you could see a situation where there are riders placed on specific species more so than there already are. We have them for, like, sage grouse right now, where the service is prohibited from spending any money on making up or down listing determinations on sage grouse. You may start seeing that with other species as well, because members of Congress might say, I don't want to go through what those states went through. If I can preempt this by not having them be able to make a listing decision, then I won't have to deal with this mess that these states are having to deal with. That's not good for species. Like, at the end of the day, like, my biggest fear is that this happening, the way it's happening, is going to have this ripple effect across the country and across species, and it's just going to be bad for wildlife as a whole. And so I hope cool heads can prevail, and that we can actually hone in and take the scalpel and fix the underlying problem, and the underlying problem being a system that wasn't, or result that wasn't anticipated by drafters 50 years ago of a law, that maybe, there are pieces that need to be updated so that this doesn't happen. This rule may never get finalized. We've been talking all this time. This is a a draft, a proposed rule. It's going to go out for public comment for 60 days. Get your comments in. It's going to be in the Federal Register. Get your comments in, right? You can go to federalregister.gov. You can do a Google search, or not a Google search, but just a search in their search bar for this rule, and you can submit your comments. It's going to be open for 60 days for comments. Get your comments in. And then they're going to have to address the comments, and they're going to go through a process. They have a year to finalize a rule and make this a final agency action. But the way that this draft rule was written, the new administration may have to, like, if they're going to take a significant change off of the draft, they're going to have to explain themselves, like why they're walking it back. It's not just as easy as saying we're pulling this one. Maybe some think it'll be that easy. I don't think it's going to be as easy as just saying we're going to pull this proposed rule. I think we're in for kind of a battle royale starting now over grizzly bears, unlike one we've ever seen before. We'll see. I do hope cooler heads prevail. Folks can come to the table, and that maybe there's a solution to this.
Well, I appreciate your, giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. I don't agree. I believe that I believe it's political, and I'll tell you why. And I think, there are a lot of folks in agencies that are career appointees, love all those guys, and have so much appreciation for the work that they do. They are there no matter who's in the administration. They're there no matter what. But the people that are calling the shots in these administrations, to the frustration of the non-politicals at these agencies, those people are appointees. And something's happening at the end of this administration, and it's real. And I'll tell you, I know that it is real, which is that, and we talked about it in another episode. There's a reason that these things come out at the end of the administration, and there's a reason that folks like Dan Ash will, get, that they end up where they are later on based on, some of these decisions. And I really think that I just believe that I don't believe it does the American people any favors. I mean, you say, like, we look at these things, and we've worked in administrations before, and we know that there isn't just one way to skin a cat. And when you get to a result like this, and you're saying, well, it's okay, we're going to roll this out at the end of, we're going to roll it out at the end of the administration in a comment period that's going to carry over. You do that with the knowledge that you have pulled the pin on a grenade. And you have
remember this. They were required by court order to publish this before January 20th. Like a federal district court judge in Wyoming, because they were slow walking this, they didn't. My understanding is they actually didn't want to issue this rule at all. They were going to leave it to the next administration to deal with it. And it was actually Judge Johnson in Wyoming that wrote an order that says, you violated the law. You took too long to respond to these petitions. You shall make a final decision on these petitions no later than January 20th of
and when did Judge Johnson tell him
oddly enough is inauguration day. What about Judge Johnson?
And when was that order set down?
3 weeks ago. In December, or it was sometime in December.
Yeah, I just have trouble, and maybe it's just the skeptic in me not believing that this is like, okay, hold my beer.
I think it was more ideological than political. I think the reason I say that
I don't disagree with you, but I don't think that those things. If you have an agency run by ideologues, that you can separate the two. Some cases, but I mean that's I don't know. That's my opinion, and I will leave it at that, and hope that we can, get some comment, go to a good place from here. And I will say this is why I think it's dangerous, and it's not going to go away. The first time I met Harriet Hageman was in court. Harriet Hageman is Wyoming's lone congresswoman, and Harriet Hageman is a bulldog, and she's a fighter. And she was representing Wyoming interests in federal court on an Endangered Species Act issue that has to do with wolves. Anybody that doesn't think that this just went to the top of Harriet Hageman's to-do list would be absolutely insane. Something's going to happen. We just don't know what.
It's funny you say that. Today, breaking news, Nephi. Maybe you saw this. She's been tapped to lead the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries, which is the panel that has jurisdiction over Western water and wildlife conservation. So yeah, you're probably right. Like this will be top of mind for her in that subcommittee, no doubt. But that doesn't surprise me. It's going to be like, here's my crystal ball. You will see bills. You'll see two types of bills relating to grizzly bears. You're going to see bills to delist grizzly bears, nationwide. You're going to see bills to delist the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population of bears. You might see bills to delist the Northern Continental Divide population of bears. You might see three different types of bills here. It wouldn't surprise me if all of those types of bills are run through committee hearing markup, and pass out of committee, probably on party line votes. But then they'll be teed up and ready to plug into some must-pass package at some point when it becomes possible in this Congress, to stack it into some of these must-pass bills, and it might be one of those that stays in. Like, I actually see a path that I didn't see several years ago for congressional grizzly bear delisting. And you have three bills that pass, and maybe you negotiate one of them into this package. I could see this being the impetus for a grizzly bear delisting because of the way this decision was or this proposal was written, and because of the impacts it could have on other species in other states, and how people might just say, I don't want this to happen to me. So I could see that more now than I could. Like, if you asked me a week ago, is there a path for congressional delisting of bears, even with a Republican trifecta? I would have said no. If you ask me today, I say, yeah, maybe.
No, I think actually
I'm not going to rule it out. I'm not going to rule it out now.
I'm leaning
towards, I would have ruled it out.
I think I'm leaning towards likely. And the only thing I'm hoping is that it doesn't just, I hope that the explosion is contained, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm hoping that when it goes off, that it's like it goes off in a way that's productive, not in a way that is catastrophic.
Yeah, maybe in a way that just delists those two populations of bears that probably warrant being delisted. This is super fascinating, and I know it's been super, super wonky. I hope we explained it in a way that was understandable. But this is a big one, and it may, like I said, it may not turn, like, this proposed rule may not become a final rule, but they've identified a legal issue, a potential legal vulnerability that I think that will have to be addressed, or it's going to be addressed by the courts at some point. And so I appreciate, Nephi, do you have any final thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
No, okay. I don't. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to this one. Even if you're in a state that doesn't have grizzlies, the reason we wanted to talk about it is it could, this is the type of thing that could happen in your state too. So appreciate you taking a listen. It's funny. We originally said we wanted, and I think we talked about it on the last podcast, we were going to do something on the Explore Act. And that was originally our plan. We were going to record an episode on the Explore Act that just passed and let everybody know what was in it. But then this happened, and so we decided to go with the breaking news instead. So maybe next time we'll cover the Explore Act and what all is in it. So until then, it means that's something you have to wait for. But listen to this one. Give us your feedback. Appreciate it as always. And remember, life is about experiences. So go have one.